Eduardo Morales, a recently widowed father of two, was rummaging through a high-end residential area's garbage on a chilly evening, hoping to find something salvageable to keep his small home functioning. His children, Lucia and Mateo, were playing nearby, too young to fully grasp the desperation their father felt. Eduardo, a man with a weathered face and a resilient spirit, had been struggling to make ends meet since the tragic accident that took his wife and left him financially crippled. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, the shadows of luxury loomed large, casting an eerie gloom. Eduardo's heart raced with hope as he felt something unusually soft among the trash. Pulling it out, he discovered a high-end rug, surprisingly out of place in this heap of waste. His pulse quickened at the thought that such an item might fetch some much-needed money, but what he found next took his breath away. Tucked within the folds of the rug was a thick envelope filled with crisp, new bills. "This is a lot of money," Eduardo murmured to himself, looking around instinctively. The weight of deciding what to do with such a find bore down on him like a boulder. "Dad, what happened?" Mateo approached, his young face etched with concern. Eduardo quickly hid the envelope. "Nothing, my son. Just an old rug," he said, trying to sound calm. "Let's take it home. It might be useful." As they prepared to leave the area, Eduardo noticed a figure in the distance, obscured by the gathering dusk. The sight of the observer sent a chill through him, mixing fear with the adrenaline of his discovery. "Mom, who is that person watching us?" Lucia asked, her voice low and tinged with fear. Eduardo tightened his grip on her hand. "I don't know, dear, but let's go home now," he said, hastening their steps. "Should we tell someone about what we found?" Mateo questioned about the luxurious rug Eduardo was carrying. His eyes were fixed on it, trying to read his father's expression. "We'll decide that at home," Eduardo replied, his mind spinning with the implications of their find. For now, they needed to keep this discovery among themselves. They hurried away, the sound of their quick steps blending with the whispers of the evening. The figure that had been watching them remained motionless, and when Eduardo looked back one last time, it had disappeared. The uncertainty of that vision left him uneasy, but the need to protect his children and the potential solution to their financial woes propelled him forward. After discovering the envelope full of money, Eduardo locked the flimsy door of their humble home with a growing sense of unease. Their house, made of worn wood and a roof barely shielding from the rain, felt even more vulnerable that night. Lucia and Mateo watched their father with sad eyes, remembering the hunger they had expressed earlier. Before deciding their next step, Eduardo improvised a simple meal with some vegetables he had managed to scavenge earlier, soothing the growling stomachs of his children. As they ate, the weight of the discovery did not ease his nervousness. He knew he needed advice and help, but without a phone at home, his only option was to seek help personally. "Mama, will we be okay?" Lucia asked innocently, nibbling on a spoonful of their dinner. Eduardo smiled at her, though his heart was tight with worry. "Yes, dear, we just need to be cautious," he responded, trying to mask his anxiety. Determined, he wrapped the envelope in an old cloth and told his children he would return soon. Eduardo walked through the poorly lit streets of the neighborhood to the small local police station, where he knew he could find someone trustworthy. Upon arrival, he found Officer Diego Sanchez patrolling nearby, as was his custom. Diego was an old acquaintance, always kind and attentive to the needs of the community. "Diego, I need help," Eduardo approached him with the hidden envelope. "I found this today. I'm afraid it might bring trouble." Diego looked at the package with seriousness. "Let's see what you found," he said, leading Eduardo inside the station where they could talk more privately. Eduardo explained the situation while Diego examined the money. "You did the right thing by bringing this here, Eduardo. This looks like a significant amount, too large to not be involved in something illegal. I'll log this and we'll investigate where it came from," Diego explained, starting to fill out a report. Leaving the money in Diego's care, Eduardo felt a momentary relief. He promised to keep everything secret until more information was discovered. Upon reaching his home's entrance, Eduardo's heart raced, still unsure if he had made the right choice. As he passed through his simple porch, a piece of paper caught his attention. A small envelope with a note lay on the worn table. Eduardo picked it up and read the handwritten message. Stay out of what doesn't concern you. Forget the money. Eduardo's blood ran cold. He looked around, but saw no one. Clutching the note in his hand, Eduardo closed the door of his home, now aware that the situation was more dangerous than he had imagined. The first thing he did was hug his children. Everything will be all right, he whispered, more to reassure himself than them. As the night drew on, the whispers and stares of neighbors increased, heightening Eduardo's sense of isolation. He suspected that rumors about his discovery might have begun to circulate. Perhaps someone had seen him going to the police. Dad, why are people acting strange? Mateo asked one morning as he watched from the kitchen window. Eduardo, preparing a modest breakfast with the money he obtained from selling some items he had found in the trash, pondered deeply before responding. Sometimes, people get nervous or scared when they don't understand something, son. They don't know what happened, but they know something did. Lucia, listening to the conversation, looked at her father with her big, worried eyes. Do they think we did something bad? She asked. No, dear, we haven't done anything wrong, assured Eduardo, arranging Lucia's hair while trying to hide his own anxiety. As the day progressed, the sensation of being watched did not diminish. Eduardo noticed a black car he didn't recognize slowly passing down the dirt street where they lived. The first time it passed, he thought it was a coincidence. The second time, his heart began to beat faster. When the car passed a third time, stopping briefly in front of his humble home before moving on, fear took hold of him. By nightfall, while the children slept, Eduardo sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling with nervousness. He tried to calm his nerves, but the silence of the house seemed to contrast starkly with the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. It was almost midnight when the sound of an engine breaking the night silence made him rise abruptly. Peering through the torn curtain, he saw the same black car parked across the street. A hooded figure got out and started walking towards his house. Eduardo quickly, his heart pounding chaotically. This can't be a coincidence, he muttered to himself, feeling a mix of fear and anger. He ran to the children's room, waking them up. We need to move to the back of the house, he whispered, guiding them to a hidden spot in the house where he kept some old tools and boxes. Dad, what's happening? Mateo asked, his voice trembling in the darkness. Stay quiet, Eduardo instructed, his voice firm but his heart in turmoil. The minutes dragged on like hours as they waited in the darkness. Eduardo listened to every sound from outside, wondering if the figure would decide to enter. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the sound of the engine was heard again, and the car drove away. Eduardo let out a sigh of relief, but he knew that the night had been more a warning than an end to their troubles. Let's go back to bed, it's okay, he said, trying to bring some normality back to the night for his children. As he led the children back to bed, Eduardo knew things were far from all right. The visit that night was a clear reminder that danger was still very close, perhaps closer than ever. The next morning, after the nighttime incident, Eduardo barely closed his eyes. As soon as the sun began to light up the dusty horizon, he was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, still with a troubled mind. Lucia and Mateo woke up to the smell of coffee and joined him, sensing the tension that still hung in the air. Dad, are you okay? Mateo asked, noticing the deep circles under Eduardo's eyes. He forced a smile while serving the coffee. Yes, my love, just a little tired, he lied, trying to protect the children from his own concerns. The day before had allowed him to sell many things. Therefore, they had a quiet breakfast. Eduardo's dream was to secure a good job so that his children could eat with dignity, but few wanted to employ a simple man like him, especially when he had no money to buy decent clothes for interviews. He managed with what little he had. After the coffee, there was a knock at the door. Eduardo's heart skipped a beat. With caution, he approached and opened the door. There stood Diego, the police officer, with a serious expression. Eduardo, we need to talk, he said, entering. There's been a development about the money you found. Eduardo led him to the small kitchen table, and Diego looked at him seriously before continuing. We discovered that the money is directly linked to a large network of financial fraud, and more worrisomely, we found out how they knew you discovered the money. Someone was watching the dumpster while you were finding the rug. A distant camera caught it, leaving the rug, and right after that, you finding it. However, we couldn't identify the person on the recording. Then, we checked the origin of the money and concluded that the person behind all this is Sergio Ruiz, a name you might recognize. Eduardo's mind raced. Sergio Ruiz was known in the city, a businessman with a reputation both as a philanthropist and as someone not to be crossed. Some said he was involved with the mafia. Eduardo had seen the man around the neighborhood, accompanied by some menacing-looking men. "What does he want from me?" Eduardo asked, his voice trembling slightly. "He wants to ensure that you don't cooperate with the police. He has a lot to lose if this investigation continues," explained Diego, looking him directly in the eyes. As soon as Diego left, a noise outside caught Eduardo's attention. He peered through the window and saw a car parking. It wasn't the black car from before, but a more expensive and imposing vehicle. Out of it stepped Sergio Ruiz himself, flanked by two large men who seemed to be there for his protection. "This time, man, you cannot ignore it." "There's no time to run," Eduardo thought. Then he opened the door, trembling with fear. "Eduardo, dear, I am Sergio Ruiz. I believe you've heard my name around here. We're all quite concerned about you," began Sergio, his voice as smooth as honey. "We heard about your find and were quite impressed with your honesty," he said, the irony clear in his tone. It was evident from his tone that he was displeased that Eduardo had turned the money over to the police as it could lead to his discovery. Despite the fear he felt, Eduardo knew he could not show any weakness, or they would use his terror against him. "What do you want with me, Sergio?" Sergio kept his focus on Eduardo. "I just want to make sure there are no misunderstandings. It would be a shame if your cooperation with the police harmed the community. We both know that sometimes it's better to let things lie, isn't it? To pretend we never found anything?" Sergio's gaze was a clear warning, and Eduardo felt a shiver run down his spine. He was here not just to intimidate him, but to do it publicly, showing that he wasn't afraid of the consequences of his actions. Even if Eduardo had reported him to the police, he came to his house at this moment, and all the neighbors must have seen Sergio's car at his door. A reminder that he feared neither those who denounced him nor the police. "I'll think about what you said," Eduardo managed to say, his voice firmer than he felt. Sergio smiled again, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perfect, that's all I ask." He turned, signaling to his bodyguards to follow him as he returned to his car. After Sergio's departure, Eduardo felt that the storm was far from over. "I'm going to solve this," he said, but the words seemed more a question than a statement. As he closed the door, he knew that the challenge he now faced was bigger than he could have ever imagined. In the days following Sergio Ruiz's visit, Eduardo felt as if he were living under a microscope. The looks from the neighbors became heavier, the whispers more frequent, and the atmosphere around his home more oppressive. Eduardo did his best to maintain a normal routine for Lucia and Matteo, but the constant fear of retaliation consumed his thoughts every moment. "Dad, people are acting strange again," Matteo commented as they returned from a quick trip to the local market. Eduardo held his hand firmly, squeezing it slightly. "We'll be all right. We just need to be strong," he replied, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. One day, when he got home, Eduardo noticed something strange at the front door. A message was scrawled in red ink, the letters carelessly formed, "Stop talking or pay the price." Eduardo's heart pounded rapidly. He looked around for someone who might be the author of the message, but the streets were unusually quiet. They wanted him to desist from the complaint, probably alleging that he had made a mistake and that the money was his. "Dad, what does this mean?" asked Lucia, her voice trembling with fear. Eduardo quickly led her inside, closing the door behind them. "Nothing, dear. It's just someone trying to scare us," he said, trying to appear calm but his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He moved away from the door and went to the public phone near the house, dialing Diego's number with trembling hands, hoping he would answer quickly. "Diego, it's Eduardo. Someone wrote a threat on my door. I'm really scared now. Found out how they knew you found the money. A man was watching the dumpster while you were there. A distant camera caught him leaving the rug and then you finding it. Although we couldn't identify him from the footage, we traced the origin of the money. It leads to Sergio Ruiz, a name you might recognize." Eduardo's mind raced. Sergio Ruiz was well known in the city, a businessman with a reputation both as a philanthropist and someone not to be crossed. Some said he was involved with organized crime. Eduardo had seen him around the neighborhood before, accompanied by some dangerous-looking men. "What does he want from me?" Eduardo asked, his voice trembling slightly. "He wants to ensure that you don't cooperate with the police. He has a lot to lose if this investigation continues," Diego explained, looking him directly in the eyes. As soon as Diego left, a noise outside drew Eduardo's attention. He peered through the window and saw a car parking. It wasn't the black car from before, but a more expensive and imposing one. Out of it stepped Sergio Ruiz in person, flanked by two large men who seemed to be there to ensure the mobster's safety. "This time, woman, I cannot ignore it." "There's no time to run," Eduardo thought as he opened the door, trembling with fear. "Eduardo, dear, I am Sergio Ruiz. I believe you've heard my name around this city. We're all very concerned about you," Sergio began, his voice as smooth as honey. He spoke about Eduardo's honesty in finding the money ironically, making it clear from his tone that he was displeased that Eduardo had returned the money to the police, which could lead to him being discovered. Despite the fear he felt, Eduardo knew he must not show any weakness, lest they use his terror against him. "What do you want with me, Sergio?" he asked. Sergio kept his focus on Eduardo. "I just want to ensure there are no misunderstandings. It would be a pity if your cooperation with the police harmed the community. We both know that sometimes it's better to leave things as they are, isn't it? And pretend we never found anything." Sergio's gaze was a clear warning, and Eduardo felt a shiver run down his spine. He was here not just to intimidate, but to do it publicly, showing he wasn't afraid of the consequences of his actions, even if Eduardo had reported him to the police. Sergio came to his house at this moment, making it clear to all the neighbors who might have seen his car at Eduardo's door that he did not fear those who reported him, nor the police. "I'll think about what you said," Eduardo managed to say, his voice firmer than he felt. Sergio smiled again, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perfect. That's all I ask." He turned, signaling his bodyguards to follow him as he returned to his car. After the man left, Eduardo felt that the storm was far from over. "I will solve this," he said, but the words sounded more like a question than a statement as he closed the door. He knew the challenge he now faced was greater than he could have ever imagined. In the days following Sergio Ruiz's visit, Eduardo felt as if he were living under a microscope. The neighbors' stares grew heavier, the whispers more frequent, and the atmosphere around his home more oppressive. Eduardo did his best to maintain a normal routine for Lucia and Matteo, but the constant fear of retaliation consumed his thoughts at every moment. "Mama, people are acting strange again," Matteo commented as they returned from a quick visit to the local market. Eduardo held his hand firmly, squeezing it slightly. "We will be okay. We just need to be strong," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. One day, upon arriving home, Eduardo noticed something strange on the front door. A message had been scrawled in red ink. The letters were carelessly formed, "Stop talking or pay the price." Eduardo's heart raced as he looked around, searching for someone who might be the author of the message, but the streets were strangely quiet. They wanted him to back down, perhaps claiming that he had made a mistake and that the money was his. "Mama, what does this mean?" Lucia asked, her voice trembling with fear. Eduardo quickly led her inside, closing the door behind them. "Nothing, dear. It's just someone trying to scare us," he said, trying to appear calm, but his heart was pounding like a drum in his chest. He moved away from the door and went to the public phone near the house, dialing Diego's number with trembling hands, hoping he would answer quickly. "Diego, it's Eduardo. Someone wrote a threat on my door. I'm really scared now," he confessed, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm coming over now," Diego responded without hesitation. "Don't leave the house, and keep the doors and windows locked." While waiting for Diego, Eduardo gathered the children in the living room, trying to distract them with games, but his mind was elsewhere. He jumped at every noise, every shadow that passed by the window, his fear growing with every minute that passed. Diego arrived in a few minutes, knocking on the door with urgency. Eduardo ran to open it, relieved to see his face. "Let me see the message," said Diego, passing by him to examine the door. His face hardened upon seeing the threatening words. "This is getting serious, Eduardo. I'll have to report this, and perhaps ask for police surveillance around here." "Will that help?" asked Eduardo, the doubt clear in his voice. "We'll do all we can," assured Diego, although his voice also carried a note of uncertainty. After Diego left, Eduardo sat on the sofa, watching Lucia and Mateo play. He felt torn between telling them the full truth about the danger they were facing and maintaining a facade of normality to protect their innocence. The morning of the next rainy day, Eduardo heard a noise outside and opened the front door of his house. On the entrance floor lay a thick envelope with no address, just Eduardo's name written on the front. His heart beat rapidly as he looked around before picking up the envelope and bringing it inside. "Mama, someone knocked on the door," Mateo observed from the living room. "No, dear. It must have been just a wrong delivery, I think," lied Eduardo, trying to keep his voice steady as he headed to the kitchen to open the envelope in privacy. He detested lying to his son, but it was necessary to keep him safe. Inside, he found a stack of densely filled documents and photographs. Eduardo began to leaf through the papers, and with each page he turned, his expression grew paler. The documents detailed a network of corruption not only linked to Sergio Ruiz, but intertwined with various prominent public figures in the city. There were records of payments, inflated contracts, and communications that involved a series of illegal activities. Someone had left that there to help him with the complaint. "This is much worse than I imagined," Eduardo whispered to himself, feeling the weight of the truth in his hands. Determined to better understand the situation, Eduardo spent the entire morning analyzing the documents, absorbing every detail, every implication. The connections went far beyond what he could have imagined, reaching the highest spheres of local power. By the afternoon, while Lucia and Mateo played in the yard, Eduardo sat in a chair, contemplating his next steps. He knew that the disclosure of this information could trigger even more severe consequences, but he also understood that remaining silent could perpetuate the corruption that affected so many lives. It was then that the public phone in front of his house rang, breaking the street's silence. Eduardo ran to it and answered with trembling hands. "Eduardo Morales?" a distorted voice asked from the other side of the line. "Yes, it's me," he responded, caution evident in his voice. "You don't know me, but I know what you received today. It's crucial that you understand the seriousness of this information I sent you. Trust no one," the voice warned, and before Eduardo could ask more, the call was cut off. Eduardo stood, the phone still in his hand, the warning echoing in his mind. He needed help, but as the anonymous voice had cautioned, who could he trust? Eduardo felt increasingly isolated in his fight with the true extent of the corruption now clearly before him. Back at home, the documents were still sprawled out in front of him, each line a web of connections and corruption that now seemed to suffocate him. "Do you want to play with us?" Lucia called from the door with her innocent voice. "Later, dear," responded Eduardo, forcing a smile. He got up, storing the documents in a drawer with a lock before joining his children. As he watched Lucia and Mateo play, the seriousness of his situation became even more palpable. Protecting those two was his priority, but to what extent could he go without compromising their safety? The internal conflict grew in Eduardo. He pondered between exposing the documents to the police and risking everything or keeping safe but complicit through silence. Each option carried its own weight, its own pain. "Dad, I'm going to Javier's house to play," Mateo shouted from the entrance, breaking Eduardo's chain of thoughts. "Wait, Mateo. I'm coming with you," Eduardo spoke. But he had left before he could finish the sentence. Eduardo's heart raced. He ran to the door, calling him, but Mateo was already out of sight. Anxiety consumed him as he considered all the possible consequences of his decision to confront Sergio Ruiz. Hours passed, and Mateo did not return. The sky had already tinted with shades of orange and purple when Eduardo began searching for him around the neighborhood, taking Lucia with him. He started asking everyone if anyone had seen his son, but no one knew his whereabouts. "Mama, where's Mateo?" "He's going to miss dinner," Lucia asked, the worry starting to form in her small eyes. Eduardo tried to keep calm, but the distress was evident in his voice. He must be around here. He'll come back soon, he tried to convince both himself and his daughter. When darkness settled and there was still no sign of Matteo, panic took over Eduardo. He took the public phone, his hands trembling as he dialed Diego's number again. "Diego, I'm Eduardo. My son Matteo has disappeared. He had only gone to a friend's house, and it's been hours," he stammered, his voice cracked by fear. "I'll send a patrol right now, Eduardo. We'll find him," Diego assured him with firmness. Eduardo hung up the phone, his heart pounding uncontrollably. The idea that Matteo's disappearance could be related to his decision to fight against corruption filled him with indescribable terror. He wondered if his pursuit of justice had gone too far, if the price to be paid would be higher than he was willing to offer. The night progressed slowly, and every minute without news from Matteo seemed like an eternity for Eduardo. He paced back and forth in the living room, frequently peering out the window, hoping to see his son running back home. Lucia, sensing the tension, played quietly in a corner, occasionally casting worried glances at her father. Suddenly, Eduardo heard the sound of a car approaching his house, and he went to the door immediately. He recognized Sergio Ruiz's vehicle and trembled. If he was with his son, Eduardo would be ready to attack, not allowing anyone to harm Matteo. "Where's my son?" he asked Sergio as soon as he was close enough to hear. "Your son, dear? You must be out of your mind," Sergio responded ironically. "I've come to propose a deal," he said with a neutral voice. "If you do anything to Matteo," Eduardo threatened, leaving the sentence hanging in the air, unafraid of the powerful man before him. "I can, yes, do something against your son. That's why I need your cooperation. I will give you a large sum of money to ensure your silence about everything you've discovered. You will have to hand over everything you know, so you will never hear my name again, and your family will be safe," Sergio stated. Eduardo knew he was lying. He would never be safe after returning Sergio's money and reporting him. "You have until tomorrow to decide, or else you will suffer the consequences," Sergio finished, turning his back on Eduardo. Eduardo knew he was not lying or exaggerating. His heart beat loudly in his chest, his concern for his son increasing. Eduardo would not risk Matteo's life, but he knew making a deal with Sergio would serve no purpose. Eduardo was still distressed when he heard the sound of police sirens. He ran to the door, fearing something had happened. It was Diego, stepping out of a police car, his expression serious but carrying a mix of relief and anxiety. "We found him," Diego said quickly as soon as Eduardo opened the door. "He's okay. He was playing in a park nearby with a friend and lost track of time." Eduardo let out a relieved sigh, feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders for a moment. "Thank you, Diego. Thank you for everything." "He's coming now," pointed Diego toward the inside of the police car, where Matteo was getting off, hesitant and visibly embarrassed. Matteo and a friend had gone to play away from the house, where he had lost track of time. That's why Eduardo had not found him when he went there. Although Eduardo had worried about the threats, fearing they might do something against his son, the situation turned out to be a simple misunderstanding. Matteo was safe and had not been the target of any malicious act involving his mother and the corruption in the city. After a tight hug and many tears, Eduardo prepared to thank Diego again, but he interrupted him with a serious gesture. "We need to talk, Eduardo," inside. Eduardo told Diego about Sergio's visit and his proposal for a deal. However, the police officer was not convinced. "You and I know that making a deal with Sergio guarantees nothing in the long run. It's just a purchase of silence, not of safety," replied Diego. Eduardo pondered deeply, every part of his being wrestling with the moral dilemma before him. "I can't accept, not after everything I've seen and know. It would be the same as being complicit, but I fear for the lives of my children." Diego nodded, respecting his decision. "I imagine you would say that. I'll keep an eye on Matteo and Lucia. I'll let all the police know so they'll be safe." After Diego left, Eduardo felt a strange peace mixed with fear. He was grateful that Matteo was safe, and at the same time feared that something might happen. He prepared the children for bed, trying to act as if everything was normal, feeling choked with concern. Eduardo went to the front of the house to get some fresh air. However, His sense of dread increased when he saw the front door slightly ajar. He remembered locking it when he went to the room. On the worn table of his porch lay an envelope with several photographs of him and his children, with a message scribbled in red, "Well in his choices." Trembling, Eduardo picked up the photograph, realizing that his decision to fight had only intensified the dangerous game in which he was involved. He now knew that every step forward would be even more dangerous, but stepping back was not an option. The challenge was just beginning. The next day, after 24 hours since Sergio's threat, near the time limit set by him, the situation worsened. He received a call on the public phone. It was Diego's police partner. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "Eduardo, I need you to come to the hospital now." "What happened?" Eduardo's voice trembled, fearing the answer. "Diego was found in the park this morning, seriously injured. He's in critical condition, intubated. He couldn't speak, but he asked me to notify you about something immediately," said Marco, his voice carrying a weight that made Eduardo's heart sink. Without wasting a second, Eduardo arranged for someone to watch the children and rushed to the hospital. The white, sterile corridor of the hospital seemed to stretch endlessly as he followed it to the ICU where Diego was admitted. Entering the room, Eduardo was confronted with the sight of Diego motionless in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and machines that beeped intermittently. Tears flooded his eyes as he saw his friend and ally in that state. Marco, Diego's police partner, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. He was attacked from behind, without a chance to defend himself. "It seems they knew exactly when he would be alone," Marco explained, the anger barely contained in his voice. "Why would they do this to him?" Eduardo asked, though deep down, he knew the answer. "They want to intimidate you, Eduardo. They want you to stop," said Marco directly, his gaze fixed on his. The reality of those words hit Eduardo like a punch. The attack on Diego was not just a message for him, but a clear warning for Eduardo. As he sat by Diego's bedside, holding his cold hand, Eduardo reflected on what to do. Every moment that passed by his injured friend's side felt like his determination was strengthening. "They want me to stop and drop the complaint," he murmured to himself, "but I can't, not now." Returning home that night, Eduardo felt the weight of his decision. He knew that continuing to fight could bring even more severe consequences, but the alternative, silence, now seemed impossible. As he opened the door of his home, a feeling of desolation overwhelmed him. It was clear that his fight had cost a lot, and the price might continue to rise. "God, please protect me. I only wanted to return the money and do the right thing," he prayed to his frightened self. Eduardo had barely closed the door behind him when he noticed something strange. An envelope was carelessly thrown on the entrance mat. On it, crudely scrawled, was his name. Trembling, Eduardo picked up the envelope, tore it open with trembling hands, and inside found a single sheet of paper with a message written in capital letters. "This is your last warning." Eduardo held the paper with trembling hands, the reality of his situation more palpable than ever. With each decision, with each step he took, the shadow of danger lengthened, touching everything and everyone he loved. The weeks following the last warning were marked by a palpable tension that seemed to envelop Eduardo's house like a thick fog. Every day that passed reinforced the security at home, placing more wood to block the door and installing new barricades on the windows, while life inside his home became a series of carefully orchestrated routines to ensure everyone's safety. On a cloudy afternoon, while Eduardo was organizing the documents he had received again, an unexpected call broke the apprehensive monotony that had set in. It was Marco, Diego's partner, with news that would make his heart stop for a moment. "Eduardo, you won't believe it. Diego woke up and is talking. He wants to testify, wants to tell everything he knows about the Ruiz and the corruption in the city. You need to testify too." Eduardo felt a mix of relief and fear. "I'm glad Diego has improved, Marco, but is it safe? After everything that has happened? We're taking all the precautions. Diego is under police protection, and we're planning the hearing so that everything remains secret until the last possible moment," Marco explained, his voice carrying a firm determination. In the days leading up to the testimony, Eduardo felt torn between the hope that they might finally expose the truth and the persistent fear of more retaliation. He visited Diego in the secure location where he was being kept, finding him notably recovered but still marked by the events that had nearly cost him his life. "Eduardo, we can't let him get away with this. He ordered me to be beaten and is threatening this to other people. This is bigger than me, bigger than us," said Diego with a conviction that strengthened Eduardo's decisions. "We have to end this." Returning home on the eve of the day marked for the testimony, Eduardo prepared a meal for his children with what little he had in the cabinets, trying to hide the anxiety that pulsed under his apparent calm. After putting Lucia and Matteo to bed, he took a few moments of quietude, looking at the starry sky, seeking some peace before the storm he knew was approaching. It was almost midnight when the phone rang, tearing through the night's silence with its urgent shrill. Eduardo answered, his heart pounding hard. "Eduardo, it's me, Diego. Someone is trying to break in where I'm hidden. I can hear noises from outside. It seems they know where I am. Try to stay in a safe place. They will probably go there too." Eduardo's blood froze. "I'll call Marco right now, and they'll send reinforcements for us. Hang in there, Diego." Hanging up the phone, Eduardo felt each heartbeat like a hammer in his conscience. He knew the next few hours would be crucial as he called Marco to report the situation. A sense of desperation took hold of him, mixing with a fierce determination. He would not allow fear to be the end of this fight. Diego had decided to face the danger to tell the truth, and she would be by his side, whatever happened. The hours that followed Diego's call were of unbearable tension. Eduardo could barely stay still, pacing around the house while waiting for news. Finally, the sun began to brighten the sky, bringing with it the day of the trial that could change everything. Arriving at the courthouse, Eduardo felt everyone's eyes on him. Some glances were sympathetic, others disdainful, and some carried a malicious gleam. Marco informed him that Diego was safe, that the police had responded in time, preventing the worst. With that small relief, Eduardo prepared to enter the courtroom, knowing that now everything was crucial. Diego was already in the courtroom, looking pale and somewhat frail, but his determination was palpable. Together, they exchanged a look of complicity and strength before taking their places. The trial began with the prosecutor outlining the network of corruption, citing evidence, and calling witnesses who bravely detailed how Sergio Ruiz and his accomplices manipulated contracts and bribed officials. Diego was one of the key witnesses, and his testimony was both an account of the corruption and an act of defiance. Eduardo watched every face in the court, trying to read their reactions. Sergio Ruiz was present, impeccably dressed, his demeanor calm, but his eyes were hard and cold. At his side, his lawyers whispered, feverishly noting every word from Diego. When it was Eduardo's turn to testify, he walked to the front with firm steps despite the fear he felt. With each word he uttered, he exposed not only Sergio's crimes, but also his own vulnerability. During a recess, as Eduardo returned to his seat, a man he recognized as one of Sergio's closest associates approached him discreetly and passed him a note. Eduardo took it with trembling hands and unfolded it under the table, reading the words written in hurried handwriting. "This won't end here. Be careful." Eduardo's blood froze. He looked around to see if anyone else had noticed the exchange, but everyone was busy with their own conversations and preparations for the next session. When the trial resumed, Eduardo felt each word of the threat burning in his mind. He tried to focus on the proceedings, on the questions from the lawyers, on the responses from the witnesses, but a part of him was always alert, always waiting for the next blow, until he finally showed the note he had been handed. The courtroom was charged with a heavy energy. People murmured, the tension hung in the air. "This is not just a case of corruption. It's a matter of justice and humanity," declared Eduardo, his voice resonating through the attentive silence of the courtroom. "I have chosen not to be silent because silence makes us accomplices. I have chosen to fight, not for myself, but for all those who have no voice in the face of this mafia." At the end of his testimony, a respectful silence hung in the air, broken only by the judge calling the next witness. Eduardo returned to his seat, feeling the weight of his words settle on the shoulders of everyone present. When the court finally closed for the day, Eduardo stood up, exhausted but resilient. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse. At the front were Sergio Ruiz's supporters, their faces twisted in fury and disdain. They had likely been threatened to be there, holding signs, shouting threatening words, and blocking Eduardo's exit. The hatred in their eyes was evident and terrifying. Eduardo stopped, his heart pounding uncontrollably. Marco placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "We are not alone in this." Looking around, he saw that some of the people in the courtroom, who had been moved by his testimony, began to join him, forming a human shield. Together, they walked toward the exit, facing the shouts and glares. Back in the refuge of his home, after the confrontation at the courthouse, Eduardo was relieved to see Lucia and Matteo playing quietly on the living room floor. The innocence of their laughter was in sharp contrast to the gravity Eduardo felt. After the testimony, he joined them on the floor, trying to find comfort in the normality of being a father, but his mind was restless. "What if I've gone too far?" he wondered, looking at his children. "What if my fight for justice only puts them in greater danger?" he said to himself. The idea that his actions might bring irreversible consequences for Lucia and Matteo was an almost unbearable burden. Later, while tucking them into bed, Eduardo kissed their foreheads, trying to convey a calm he did not feel himself. "Good night, my loves. Everything will be all right," he murmured, more as a promise to himself than as a guarantee for them. After making sure they were asleep, Eduardo sat at the table under the dim light, allowing himself a moment of despair. The fight seemed endless, and for a moment, he pondered the possibility of giving up. It was then that the public phone rang in the street, cutting through the night silence like an alarm signal. Hesitant, Eduardo ran to it and answered, fearing it might be someone sent by Sergio. Eduardo Morales. The voice on the other side was distorted, almost unrecognizable due to a voice modulator. "Yes, who is speaking?" Eduardo responded, his voice trembling. "I can't tell who I am, but I know what you need. I have in my possession one last piece of evidence that can change the game in your favor, one that can ensure that Sergio Ruiz and his accomplices don't escape this time," the voice said. Eduardo felt his heart race. "How can I believe you? How do I know this isn't a trap?" "You have no way of knowing," admitted the voice. "But it was I who gave you the previous documents that proved some things about Sergio. Then you know you're safe with me. I'll be in the city park tomorrow at dawn, alone. If you want the truth, come find it." The call was cut as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Eduardo with the receiver still in his hand and a whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. It was an opportunity, perhaps the last, to obtain what he needed to secure justice, but it could also be a fatal risk. Eduardo spent the night awake, pondering his decision. At the first ray of sunlight, he made his choice, strengthened by the thought that each step he took was for a cause greater than his own safety. With renewed determination, he prepared for the meeting, knowing this could be the decisive turn in his tireless fight for justice. At dawn, Eduardo walked toward the city park, where the decisive meeting was scheduled. The morning fog still covered the park, transforming every bench and every tree into a stage of mystery and tension. He remained alert, attentive to any suspicious movement. Finally, he spotted a solitary figure near the lake, wrapped in a large coat. Cautiously, Eduardo approached, feeling that this moment could be both a trap and the key to his fight. The figure lowered the hood, revealing herself as a woman with eyes marked by a somber resolution. "Eduardo Morales?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes, it's me. You said you had something for me?" Eduardo responded, trying to maintain his composure. The woman handed Eduardo a thick envelope. "I'm a former assistant to Sergio Ruiz. Here are recordings of Sergio admitting to everything, from bribes to manipulations. I can no longer live with this. I hope it helps," she said. Eduardo held the envelope, his hands shaking. "Why now?" "I saw what he did to people, to you, and I don't want to be part of that anymore. I thought being by his side would bring me security, but it only brought guilt," explained the woman before quickly walking away, leaving Eduardo with the recordings in his hands. Returning to the courthouse the next day, the recordings were played before the judge and jury. Sergio tried to defend himself, but the evidence was irrefutable. During the trial, Sergio himself was forced to admit his motivations in a shocking statement. "I thought I could control everything and everyone. The power blinded me to justice and morality. I was wrong," confessed Sergio, his posture finally broken. At the end of the trial, the judge addressed Eduardo directly before pronouncing the sentence. "Mr. Morales, your courage and determination not only exposed a deep network of corruption, but also saved this community from further harm. It is only right that you be compensated for your heroism and for all the hardships you faced." In this way, the judge ordered that a significant portion of the assets confiscated from Sergio Ruiz be allocated to Eduardo as a form of reparation. In this way, the judge ordered that a significant portion of the assets confiscated from Sergio Ruiz be allocated to Eduardo as a form of reparations and recognition for his crucial role in the case. With this financial reward, Eduardo not only ensured a bright educational future for Lucia and Matteo, but also acquired a new home, symbolizing a fresh start for the family. Weeks later, Eduardo's story was frequently recounted as an example of courage and integrity. He had become an inspiring figure in his community, encouraging others to speak out against injustice and threats. "You've changed our city, Dad," Matteo said one evening as they watched the starry sky from the yard of their new home. Eduardo smiled, stroking his son's hair. "We changed it, my love. All of us who chose to speak out. And we'll keep changing it for the better." It was the peace of knowing that the struggle was worth it, and that peace was the greatest reward of all. 5 years after the trial that shook the foundations of their city, Eduardo watched his children in the yard of their new, sun-drenched home. Lucia, now a bright teenager, was studying under the shade of a lush tree, while Matteo, older and nearly a young man, helped with the garden plants. The education Eduardo had secured with the financial reward had transformed their lives. Lucia showed a remarkable talent for the sciences, dreaming of becoming an engineer, while Matteo had developed a passion for literature, often found with a book in his hands, lost in worlds created by words. Finally, Eduardo had found a job, and the children no longer suffered from need, living happily by their father's side. The community around them had also changed. Where once fear and corruption reigned, a spirit of cooperation and justice now flourished. Eduardo had played a crucial role in this transformation, not only as the man who challenged Sergio Ruiz, but as an inspiring figure who continued to work alongside the community to ensure that the shadows of the past did not return. Sergio Ruiz and his accomplices, after being convicted, spent their days in prison. The recordings brought by his former assistant had been the final blow to his network of corruption, dismantling not only his illicit operations, but also serving as a warning to others who ventured down similar paths. Diego, recovered from his injuries, had become the chief of the local police, leading an era of reforms and transparency within the force. He and Eduardo maintained a strong friendship, united by a shared history of struggle and overcoming. Diego often visited Eduardo's home, each meeting a reminder of their shared journey and the bonds they formed. On a peaceful afternoon during one of these visits, Eduardo prepared tea while reflecting on the impact of their story. "It's strange to think that our story is being studied. I just returned the money and reported what I discovered. I just did my part," commented Eduardo. "But it's important," replied Diego. "It's a reminder that no matter how difficult, it's worth fighting for what's right. No matter the difficulty, it's necessary to stay honest," he continued. Diego's company brought with it laughter and an energy always welcome. They sat in the garden, the sun setting behind the trees, the conversation flowing between the past and the future, between memories of dark times and plans for a brighter tomorrow. "You've changed our city, Eduardo. You've changed our lives," said Diego, raising his glass in a toast. Eduardo smiled, looking at his children who had joined them. "We changed it, all of us, and we'll keep changing it for the better." As the night fell over the city, once trembling under the weight of corruption, now illuminated by the promise of justice and renewal, Eduardo felt truly at peace, not just for having won the battle, but for knowing that his fight would inspire others not to fear the darkness, to stand up and speak, no matter how powerful the forces against them. And in that truth, Eduardo found not just peace but a purpose that would define the rest of his days.